Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this programme today, we'll be asking what lies behind this new axis that consists of Iran, Russia and Turkey. Warm welcome to the programme, and have a special guest once again, Avi Lipkin. Avi, absolute pleasure to have you on the programme, and so pleased that we could record a couple of programmes together. So thank you for joining me on today's programme. And Avi, would you give us a little bit of an insight, because what we're seeing develop in the Middle East is new alliances that were once possibly unthought of, particularly the likes of ancient historic empires coming together, such as the Iranians, such as the Turks, under Russian influence. Can you explain to us what's happening in the Middle East today?
Yes. I firstly look at history, especially the history of Eastern Europe and its relations with Turkey over the last 1,000 years. This is one level. Another level, of course, is the relationship between Turkey and Iran, and Turkey and other countries in the Middle East in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years. And there are interesting things that all of a sudden you see a so-called alliance between Russia, Turkey, and Iran. And I think it's a sham. I mean, of course, I do believe that the three of them want the United States out of the Middle East. I don't think the United States is going to give up so quickly in the Middle East. As you know, the Saudis and the Israelis want the United States in. But what I want to do is, I want to do a little bit of basic training.
That'll be good.
What?
That'll be good.
Good. Firstly, the Turks conquered much of Europe. The Turks reached Vienna, and they laid siege to Vienna. The Polish king, Sobieski, came down in 1683, and he defeated the Turkish army at Vienna. What did the Turks say now? We're going to take Vienna. We're going to take Hungary. We're going to take Romania. We're going to take Bulgaria. We're going to take Greece. And Erdogan, President Erdogan, has now said that they're going to invade the 18 Greek islands in the Aegean. Now, even the most basic newcomers know that Russian Orthodox Christianity of Putin will never allow the Turks to invade Christian Eastern Europe. Again, Greeks, Bulgarians, Romanians, Serbs. Russia sees itself as the father country for these nations. So if Turkey thinks that it's going to conquer the Balkans again and go all the way up to Vienna, there's no way that the Russian government would ever agree to it, under Putin or under anyone else. Another thing, the Russians have been fighting the Turks for 1,000 years. Now, I'm here in the UK. I love England. I love the whole history of England and the Magna Carta and the Crusades and everything. But I was born in the United States. And American history starts in 1620 with Plymouth Rock, and before that, American eyes glaze over. Americans cannot comprehend things that happened 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago. And these are things that the Russians and the Turks have been contending with. The Russians and Turks have been fighting each other for over 1,000 years. Let me tell you a little story from Israel. I'm listening to the radio in the morning, just before I was going to fly from Israel to Europe, or to the US, and they brought on the radio show an Israeli army officer who's a Muslim. He's not an Arab. He's from a group called the Circassians. And the Circassians were Turkish soldiers posted in the Holy Land before World War I. They were among the best soldiers the Ottoman Sultan had. And he said, we will never forget We were from what is today a city called Sochi in the southern part of Russia. This was the Turkish Empire. And the Tsarist army came down. Again, you have to remember, Crimean War. Nobody knows the history of the Crimean War. And if you remember, the British and the French and the Turks were fighting the Russians.
Absolutely, yep.
And the Russians came down to Sochi, and according, I don't know if it's true or not, according to the traditions of the Circassian nation, the Russian Tsarist army killed 3 million Turks. Everybody talks about the Armenians, Turks killing the Armenians, but the Turks, especially the Circassian Turks, remember the Christian Russian crusaders killing them. I mean, there's a history going back to the Crusades. And so those who could escape went to Turkey. And then the Turkish Sultan posted them as garrisons in the Holy Land. Today they serve in the Israeli army. They're Israeli citizens, but they're Turkish Muslims. Just shows you how racist and apartheid Israel is.
Absolutely, yes.
And we have Bedouin soldiers, and we have Druze soldiers, we have Christian soldiers, we have all kinds of soldiers. Good. So there are many, many Turks, and there are many, many Muslims who look at Russia as the Jews look at the Nazis, because there's a horrible history. And of course, some people could contend that what Ataturk, or what the Turkish Sultan did to the Armenians and the Greeks, is simply tit for tat for what the Russians did 50 years before to the Circassians. I don't know if you remember Man of La Mancha. Man of La Mancha is, it was Don Quixote in Spanish. Don Quixote was written by Miguel de Cervantes. And I was taught in school in the United States that this was a spoof on Spanish history and Spanish culture and Spanish nobility. It wasn't a spoof. Miguel de Cervantes lost his right hand in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, fighting the Turks in the Turkish Navy. Lepanto was a Greek island there. And the defeat of the Turkish fleet in 1571 was the beginning of the end of the Turkish Empire. Because in those days, it was whoever controls the seas. You know, Britannia rules the waves, you know. In those days, Turkey ruled the waves in 1571. So this is a multi-front war. I'm an expert on Spanish history. Why did Ferdinand and Isabella expel the Muslims and the Jews in 1492? Because the Turkish fleet was right off the coast of southern Spain. And Morocco and Algeria were part of the Ottoman Empire at that time. And the Turks were about to invade Spain. It was going to be the 4th Muslim invasion of Spain. And so the Spanish did not want the Granada regime of Boabdil. So there's a multi-front, multi-century, multi-country war going on with the Turks. And the Russian, as Russian Orthodox, it's 1,000 years of war with the Turks. Now, I want to go to a slightly different direction. I mean, we're building up around this new so-called alliance. After the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2011, the Egyptian government said that they were going to support Bashar al-Assad, they were going to attack Bashar al-Assad. Now the Egyptian government likes Bashar al-Assad, but at the beginning they didn't like Bashar al-Assad. And the Iranians, okay, listen carefully, the Iranians who backed Bashar al-Assad were saying to the Egyptians, if you attack Bashar al-Assad, if you attack the Shiites, the Egyptians are Sunnis, if you attack the Shiites, we're going to nuke the Aswan Dam. Now, do you know Ezekiel 28 and 29? It says, nobody will live in Egypt for 40 years. No human and no animal will tread in Egypt for 40 years. All the way from Aswan down to Migdol. And this was a very clear description of a possible Iranian nuclear strike or missile strike at the Aswan Dam. Today, because the Egyptian government of al-Sisi is very, very much against the Muslim Brotherhood, they support Bashar al-Assad. It's an interesting change in politics. Now, there is a rivalry. Ethnically, the Turks and the Iranians have a lot of similarities, but there is a rivalry between them over who's going to rule in the Islamic world. Now, I think most of your viewers do not know this, but Turkey's population is 31% Shiite Alawite, in other words, the enemies of Erdogan, the enemies of the Sunnis. 25% are Kurdish. And only 44% of Turkey is Turkish, Turkish Sunni. Now, Erdogan was mayor of Istanbul, and he was going to make a deal with some contractors to develop a very, very nice area of Istanbul. But what happened was there was a very, very popular public park that all the people of Istanbul would go to. And they were handing this over almost for free to the contractors. And riots started in Istanbul because the people in Turkey said, no, we want that area as a public park. We don't want it to be turned into some kind of condo area. And the Iranians, I'll get to the Iranians. So Erdogan says there is a foreign country meddling in Turkish affairs regarding that park. And what it was Iran, not Israel, it was Iran. And Iran was saying to Erdogan, if you turn that into a condominium area and take the park away from the people, we are going to turn all the 31% of the Shiites in Turkey against you. In other words, Turkey basically would implode. Turkey would be driven into a civil war in which the Shiites, the Sunnis, and the Kurds would all be fighting each other. And one of the points I want to share is that Turkey is on the verge of ethnic collapse if this happens. Iran is on the verge of ethnic collapse if this happens. Iran, for example, the north or northwestern part of Iran is divided up in two areas, Kurdish and Azeri. Now, the Azeris are linked ethnically to a country called Azerbaijan, which was part of the Soviet Union. It's now an independent Muslim country. But the Azeris have their irredentist viewpoint on the Azeri area of Iran. The Kurds of Iran want to join up with the Kurds of Iraq and Turkey and Syria. The Iranians are totally brutal with their ethnic minorities. So you have the Turks, you have the Iranians, you have the Shiites, you have the Sunnis, and in the middle of all this, you have the Kurds and you have the Azeris, all having their eyes on northern Iran. And if you see, for example, the missile strikes that are hitting the Iranian troops in Syria today, and Iranian soldiers being sent back in body bags, and the Iranian people know that Israel is not their enemy, and the Iranian people knows that they're starving, and the Iranian rial is rapidly losing all its value. Why? Because of the insane regime that they have. And the Israelis have said to the Iranian people, you are not the enemy. So I see, in the end, a collapse of Iran and a national revolution by Iranian people against the regime. And I see in Turkey, people are getting organized now in Turkey against Erdogan. And you know what? The Russians are laughing at the useful idiots. That's the alliance that I see.
Interesting. When it comes down to Iran and Iran's intentions, certainly since the second Gulf War in 2003, the Iranians have exploited the downfall of Saddam Hussein's regime and are wanting to build what is known as Shia Crescent. Can you tell us about Iran's ambitions and why they're targeting Israel, but also why they're building this thing called the Shia Crescent?
Okay.
Thanks, Avi.
I have to say a few things from what I know of American diplomacy. And I have to go back to the late 40s, early 1950s. The Iranian people, after World War II, elected a man by the name of Mossadegh. Mossadegh was their leader, very popular, very patriotic leader of Iran. And he declared neutrality between Russia and the West. In other words, if you remember, in World War II, Iran had been divided up into British, American, and Soviet spheres. And so after World War II, the Americans and the British were very wary of Iran falling into the hands of the Soviets, because the Soviets wanted to have a warm water port. So when Mossadegh said he was going to be neutral, they kicked him out. The Iranians never forgave America for kicking out Mossadegh, the Americans and the British. Then they installed the Shah of Iran. So Reza Pahlavi turned out to be one of the best friends America ever had in the Middle East, one of the best friends Israel ever had. Iran was an ally of Israel at that time. Okay. One of the things that drives, I'm not a Muslim, obviously, but one of the things that drives the Muslims crazy is the vacillations in the decision-making of the Americans. So America proves itself to be against Iran with the overthrow of Mossadegh. Then the United States goes against the Shah under Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter says, oh, there is this man of God in Paris. His name is Ayatollah Khomeini. And I'm a Baptist from Georgia, and I'm going to work with a man of God who believes in Allah, because we all believe in the same God, don't we? And he overthrows the Shah. So what's your conclusion? That the Americans stab their allies in the back. And they bring in Khomeini thinking it'll be their friend. The first thing he does, he takes the American embassy captive. And what are they yelling in the streets of Iran? Death to America, death to Israel, because they didn't forget what America did to Mossadegh. Then comes the great savior and hero. You know who the great savior is? Saddam Hussein. And the Americans say to Saddam Hussein, you go to war against Iran and save Western civilization from Iran. And so Saddam Hussein starts a war of 9 years in which the borders do not change. 2 million, I don't want to say innocent people. 2 million Iranians and 2 million Iraqi people die. The borders don't change. There's no conclusive end to the war. And then after the war, the United States stabs Saddam Hussein in the back. So Sunnis and Shiites look at America and the Americans keep changing their allies. Israel watches this too. And so the people in Egypt, Mubarak was asked to join in a war against Saddam Hussein. And Mubarak is a Sunni. So he says, no, I'm not going to join a war against Iraq because I see every time you work with the United States, you get stabbed in the back. So people in the Middle East are very, very afraid to work with the United States of America. Okay. Then comes George W. Bush. I have a lot of respect for George W. Bush. And he says, with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, we're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and we're going to bring democracy to Iraq. So firstly, the Saudis are saying, democracy over our dead body. There is no such thing as democracy in Islam. But what happens is, Saddam Hussein is overthrown, he's hanged, and George W. Bush says, okay, now we're going to bring democracy to Iraq. What's democracy? Majority rule. What's majority rule? The Shiites are the majority in Iraq. So if the Shiites are the majority in Iraq and Iran is Shiite, George W. Bush actually creates a new constellation of power between the new rulers of Iraq, 60% Shiites, and Iran. In other words, George W. Bush's faulty thinking leads to an alliance between the Iraqi Shiites and the Iranian Shiites. So then, the Shiite regime in Iraq fires all of Saddam Hussein's generals and officers. They're now without jobs. And they form ISIS. ISIS was formed because of the vacillation of the United States in supporting Saddam Hussein and the Sunnis, and then supporting the Shiites, and then supporting the Sunnis. I mean, the Muslims are going crazy with this American behavior. I live in the Middle East. I know how they think. Okay. So then the world comes against ISIS and against the Sunnis, and you see now the Sunnis are very low profile. But the Sunnis are 85% of Islam. Okay, now I want to show something very important. I'm going to shift over to Europe and come back. I mean, all of these things are all together. You have to know all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to get the picture.
Absolutely.
Turkey wants to join the European Union. And there are many European countries say, no, we'll be overrun by Muslims. Let me explain the numbers. Today, ballpark figures. You have 50 million Muslims and 300 million non-Muslims in Europe. So you say 50 million, 300 million, it's a Christian continent. But if Anatolia, Turkey joins, that's 70 million, so it's 120 million Muslims in Europe. But it's not only 120 million, because you have 200 million Turkic Muslims who belong to the former Soviet Union. The 6 stands, the 6 republics that broke away from the Soviet Union, 200 million Turks. You want to talk about Armageddon? That's the Armageddon, it's not the Russians. So then you have 50 million Muslims in Europe, 70 million Anatolians, and 200 million Soviet Turks. That's 320 million Muslims immediately joining the European Union, because the Turkic Muslims are entitled to Turkish passports, which means they're entitled to European passports. So overnight, Europe is a Muslim continent because 320 million Muslims versus 300 million non-Muslims. So a lot of European nations don't want to know about the Turks joining the European Union. And I have news for you, the Russians are also very concerned. because the traditional enmity between Turkey or the Turkish nations and Russia is still there. And today, the Russian army is approaching 50% Turkish conscripts, or Turkic conscripts, meaning if the Russian army becomes Muslim, eventually Russia becomes Muslim. So there is a global problem of Islamic numbers overwhelming the Christian numbers.
So let's have a look now at the emergence of this Iranian Shia crescent that's dominating the Middle East.
نقطه مهم و شیرین سال گذشته این بود که تهدیدهای منطقه‌ای.
In an Iranian New Year's message on state television, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said Iran has diffused all regional threats that threatened the Islamic Republic.
در این سال این تهدیدها رو تبدیل کنه به فرصت.
The Ayatollah didn't dwell on specifics, but did say the threats have turned into opportunities.
و کسانی که آگاه از مسائل بین
With Daesh driven out of its so-called caliphate in Syria and Iraq, the Iranian-backed Assad regime in control of Syria's main cities, and Iranian relationships strengthened in Iraq, Iran has indeed capitalized on the vast instability in the region. Iranian proxy militias take orders from the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's elite Al-Quds force, Major General Qasem Soleimani, in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Nearly two-thirds of the militias who beat back Daesh in Iraq are loyal to Iran. But it's not just military might. Iran is Iraq's top trading partner. The two countries' annual trade volume has hit $12 billion. Saudi Arabia's trade with Iraq stands at half that amount. There are Iraqi political parties and groups like the Badr organization that have ties with Iran stretching back to the 1980s fight against Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq War. Outgoing U.S. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster said recently that since 2012, Iran has funneled $16 billion to the Assad regime in Syria, as well as to proxy militias in Iraq and Yemen. Iran has nearly completed its Shia crescent of influence, stretching from its capital Tehran to Baghdad to Damascus and to Beirut. Meanwhile, U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis says the U.S. has evidence Iran is trying to influence the upcoming Iraqi elections. Like it or not, the militias loyal to Iran fought under the umbrella of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which was officially incorporated into Iraq's security forces by Iraqi lawmakers. While the militias are banned from overtly entering Iraqi politics, nearly 30 political parties affiliated with them are registered for general elections in May. Up for re-election, Prime Minister Haidar al-Abadi has struck a more nationalistic tone and has been welcoming to both Iran and the U.S. But regardless of who wins the election and what alliances are formed, one thing is clear: Iran will likely have many friends in the new Iraqi government. Courtney Keeley, Straight Talk.
And Avi, we saw in that excellent video presentation there how the Iranians are building up this Shia crescent. Now, one thing with Iran is they're very, very clever in terms of carrying out military operations, because we don't see the Iranians are invading other nations, but technically what they are doing is they are trying to change the situation on the ground, whether that be in Iraq, or whether that be in Syria, whether that be in Lebanon, or throughout the Middle East, even in Africa and South America, is that they want to use that sphere of influence to actually change those nations, so that those nations actually favor the Islamic Republic of Iran. To what extent are the Iranians involved in Syria and in propping up Assad's regime, that they've deployed the Iranian Revolutionary Guards together with the Iranian Basijis and others, and now that Syria has become the operational point for Iranian military to target Israel?
What many people, especially in the West, don't understand is that there is a 1,400-year war taking place between the Shiites and the Sunnis. The Sunnis are 85%, the Shiites are 15%. So I ask you rhetorically, who's going to win? The Sunnis. Who backs the Sunnis? The United States and the Europeans. Who backs the Shiites? Russia and China. Now, China, I'm changing the subject, but I'm coming back. China has a very big Muslim majority, and they're Sunnis. They're Uyghurs. helping the Uyghurs to fight the Chinese government are Taliban coming in from Pakistan and Afghanistan. And these are Sunnis. The same Taliban from Pakistan and Afghanistan are slaughtering the Hazaras in Afghanistan, who are Shiites. So the Shiites, the Hazaras, they get angry. And then Iran comes and says, join us. We'll be in a battle against the Taliban, who are Sunnis. Okay? Saddam Hussein was backed by the Sunnis, by the Taliban. Okay. Pakistan has a very big Shiite minority. They're also persecuted and slaughtered. I don't know if you hear all the time about the mosques, the Shiite mosques being blown up in Pakistan by the Sunnis. They've got this hatred. It's like 1,000 times worse than the Catholics and the Protestants during the 300 years of wars of Reformation. So the Shiites of Afghanistan, the Shiites of Pakistan go to Iran, go to Syria, get training, get money in order to go back to fight the Sunnis. This is a long-term war of 1,400 years between the Sunnis and the Shiites. I also did a CD and DVD with Chuck Missler about the Sunnis and the Shiites. I talk about this. Now, Iraq, we spoke about this just a few minutes ago, has 60% of its population is Shiite. When George W. Bush says we're going to bring democracy to Iraq, what he means is we're going to hand the power over to the Shiites because they're 60%. Saddam Hussein is 20%, and the Kurds are 20%. Now you have a war in Yemen, and you've got a group called the Houthis. And they're also downtrodden because their Islam is not the Wahhabi Islam. So they join Iran. Iran supports them financially. You've got these ballistic missiles taking off from Yemen and hitting strategic sites in Saudi Arabia. Again, this is a multi-front, multicultural, multi-nation war against the Sunnis. Now you have, in Lebanon, you have a group called Hezbollah. Hezbollah are Shiites. And, you know, like I said, I've been living in Israel 50 years. And from our knowledge of the ethnic groups in Lebanon, the Shiites in Lebanon, I don't mean to be racist, I'm telling you what the Lebanese are saying. The Lebanese Sunnis, Christians, and Druze say that the Shiites are mentally retarded and that they are downtrodden by all the other groups. So Iran comes in to Lebanon, to the Hezbollah, says, you're not going to be retarded anymore, we're going to help you. We're going to defeat the Sunnis and the Christians and the Druze. So Hezbollah is the proxy in Lebanon. Syria, you have the Shiite Alawites with Bashar al-Assad. And 31% of Turkey is Shiite Alawite. And then in Iraq, you have 60%. And in Iran, you have 50% of the population is Farsi. You have more Shiites, but 50% is Farsi, Persian. And you have Afghanistan, and you have Pakistan. And these nations are now banding together in an alliance to defeat the Sunnis. Now, if you'll excuse me for this famous word in Christianity, eschatology, what I see happening is that with the help of the West, in the end, the Sunnis are going to win. When the Sunnis win, they're going to come, and I'm going to tell you a little story. It's like a joke, but it's not a joke. It's very serious. My wife, Rachel, picks up a TV broadcast. I think we did this last time. And he gets a death sentence because he's pretending to be an ISIS guard in the caliphate, and a car comes up with Lebanese plates. And there are four men in the car. You have a Shiite, a Sunni, a Christian, and a Druze. And so the Sunni guard says, what are you? I'm Druze. I believe in Jethro as the greatest prophet. And then the Christian says, I believe in Jesus Christ as the greatest. And the Shiite says, I'm a Shiite. Shiites are infidels in the eyes of the Sunnis. ISIS is always saying, kill the Shiites first and kill everybody else after. But the Shiites have to be killed first. And then the Sunni, he has to die too because he's a collaborator with the other three groups. And he takes his machine gun and he kills the four guys in the car. So when the Sunnis make their comeback, they will come for Lebanon and kill all the groups, including the Christians. Same with Syria, same with Iraq. And if Russia is backing Iran, and if Russia pulls out, Iran falls, the Shiites fall, Sunnis take over, and then the Christians and the Druze and the Shiites and the Kurds are going to say to Israel, come in quickly and save us. And that's when you're going to see Israeli borders growing. I know this is a total surprise for everyone that all of a sudden I take this out of my hat. But I believe what's going to happen is the Shiites in the end with their grand alliance and with the Russians. The Russians support the Shiites because the Shiites are the enemies of the Sunnis, the Turks. The Russians have always been the enemies of the Turks. I cannot imagine the Russians allowing the Turks to take Bulgaria and Romania and Greece and Serbia and Cyprus and all these things. Russia is going to put its foot down and prevent the Turks from doing these things.
Oh, interesting. And Avi, can you explain to us as well the operational base actually within Syria now? That in recent weeks we've seen an escalation in Israeli military strikes against Iran's military facilities in Syria, and preventing Iran from actually changing the balance of power in Syria and in Lebanon to favour Hezbollah. Now, what's Israel's security situation vis-a-vis the Iranian threat in Syria?
Okay, the Iranians are trying to build bases all around the country. The Iranians are storing weapons under the ground in bunkers. You heard of the Moab, mother of all bombs. It's an American invention. And these penetrate the ground, and they can blow up objectives underneath the ground. And this is something we have been seeing the last few weeks. And we cannot say, or we do not know, is it Israel that did it, or did the Americans do it, or who did it? But the point is that there are forces out there, including America and Israel, that don't want Iran to develop Syria as a forward base. But what is happening indeed is that the Iranians and the Russians and the Shiite militias, like I said before, from Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran and Iraq and even Houthis, these people are coming in the tens of thousands to join Hezbollah in Syria to defeat the Sunnis. And so it is only logical that Iran, as the chief military power on the Islamic side, the Shiite side, is going to try to establish itself with bases in Syria. But these bases threaten Israel, and Israel won't agree to it. And so what Israel's trying to do is just have an open line to the Russians and say, listen, this is wrong. Israel knows where everything is. So Israel says to the Russians, get your men out of there, or get your planes out of there, because we're going to attack there. And it's like, you know, the United States did this bombing recently in Syria. I think it was 100 missiles were fired, and they said to the Russians like a day or two before, get your men out of there, because we're going to bomb the heck out of the Syrians. And the Russians got their men out. In other words, there is an open line between Russia and the United States. So similarly, there's an open line between Russia and Israel.
And we haven't seen a major flare-up between Israel and the Iranian proxies Hezbollah since 2006. But according to Naftali Bennett last October, that Hezbollah has something like 160,000 rockets and missiles targeted Israel. And we're seeing this growing tension between Israel and the Iranians. Could we see a conflict between Israel and Iran, both in Lebanon and also in Syria in the near future?
Well, indeed, our foreign minister, our defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, said very clearly, we will do whatever we have to do, whatever the price, to ensure that the Iranians don't establish themselves in Syria. So if that means that the Iranians want to counterattack, they can. But the Iranians know what the red lines are, but they cross them all the time, thinking that they're going to call Israel's bluff.
So let's have a look now at Eric Steckelbeck and also Chris Mitchell talking about this new emerging Iranian corridor.
We're talking to Chris Mitchell, Euromedinger, about everything going on in this region right now. And one of the major developments, gentlemen, in this region is the Iranian axis marching across it, whether it's Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon. Iran is hell-bent on establishing a new Persian empire, I guess you would say. Chris, I'll start with you. We had a major flare-up, actually, in Syria just last month. Iran, Israel, a drone invaded Israeli airspace. There was a major flare-up there. Talk more about why Iran's presence in Syria is a red line for Israel.
It is, because they're starting to establish military bases inside Syria, and they're using the Syrian war in the vacuum that it's created to create that land bridge all the way from Tehran to the Mediterranean. So that is the major concern, I think, for Israel right now. It's almost up there on Israel's northern border. They're talking about the next war that could be not only with Syria and Iran in Syria, but also in Lebanon with Hezbollah. They're talking about a first Northern Front war. And so it is the major concern. We talked to Renon Bergman, an Israeli journalist, who said that unless something happens, I mean, war seems inevitable right now between Iran and Israel.
Chris, that's a great point, because it seems like Iran, again, is hell-bent on establishing that presence in Syria at Israel's doorstep. Israel says this is an absolute red line.
That's right.
It seems inevitable that conflict is coming.
Israel's, I'm sure, telling that to the United States, and I think the United States really needs to step up and really stand behind Israel, because this could really upset the whole Middle East. One other thing, Eric, just quickly, Israel has set up a good neighbor policy actually on the border right now. In the midst of the Syrian war, they've treated more than 5,000 Syrians in Israeli hospitals. They're sending Christian medical personnel inside Syria to help the rebels. It's one of the good news stories of what Israel's doing here in the Middle East.
Yeah, and Chris, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a little told story, especially in the mainstream media back in the West, that Israel is actually helping wounded Syrians and Syrian refugees. An amazing story. Yoram, when I think of Iran and its presence in Syria and across the region, I think of Iran's most dangerous proxy, Hezbollah. Hezbollah is shoulder to shoulder with Iran and Russia, by the way, in Syria. Talk about the nature of the Hezbollah threat so people at home understand. Look, this is over 120,000 rockets and missiles pointed at every inch of Israel right now?
Well, certainly Hezbollah has been an effective threat to Israel. Hezbollah has been an effective tool in the hands of Assad of Syria to remain in control, and Hezbollah has been basically a stooge of the Ayatollahs in Iran. As such, they facilitate the Iranian expansion from the Persian Gulf through Iraq, Syria, all the way to Lebanon and the Mediterranean, which basically constitutes, it exposes the real clear and present danger to American interest in the region posed by Iran. As much as Iran is a threat to Israel, primarily it's a threat to the U.S. in the Middle East.
The great Satan.
Iran's #1 target is not to destroy Israel, which is also a target, but the primary target is to remove the U.S. from the Persian Gulf in order to facilitate the Ayatollah's intentions to topple every single pro-American regime. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Oman, through Jordan, all the way to Egypt, which would bode disaster to America's economic and national security and homeland security interest. In that context, U.S. and Israel have made up their mind to focus on that threat rather than on the Palestinian issue, the Arab-Israeli conflict, which are very, very secondary to the primary issues, namely to clip the wings of the Ayatollahs.
Yeah, that long Iranian shadow, you are descending upon the region. A scary thought. Chris, we only have about 30 seconds left until the break. Russia is also here at Israel's doorstep now. They're aligned with Iran. Seems like they're not going anywhere.
No, I don't think so. They came in in 2015. They made that announcement to the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and right now they're allied with the Assad regime. Actually, Russia coming in saved the Assad regime right now, and here we are 7 years into the Syrian civil war. 500,000 people have died, 11 million refugees, and Russia right now is playing a key role buttressing up the Assad regime, and actually an ally of Iran as well. So this is something the U.S., Israel is going to have to deal with for years to come, it seems.
Excellent discussion there with Chris Mitchell and also Eric Steckelbeck, both been guests on the Middle East Report. Avi, you know, what united pretty much the Iranians together with the Russians was the threat posed by ISIS. And now that the fact that ISIS power and its influence and the so-called Islamic Caliphate is crumbling, we're now seeing, for example, closer ties between the Russians and the Iranians, to the extent that the Russians now are actually supplying the Iranians and Hezbollah with intelligence. They are on joint patrols. They are fighting the Sunni jihadists in Syria together, so their intelligence is very, very strong. Isn't this a very disturbing factor that since really the Obama administration pulled American influence out of the Middle East, that the Russians are really using the Syrian conflict as a means to exert their authority and power in the region?
Absolutely. They also have their ports in Tartus and Latakia, warm water ports, and I don't think the Russians will ever want to pull out of that. I want to say something I think very important about the Russian support for Syria and the Russian support for Iran. You have to remember, Russia is a 1,000-year-old enemy of the Sunnis and the Turks. That's why I'm saying I don't believe at all in this so-called alliance with Turkey. Iran and Russia, yes. Turkey, useful idiot, maybe you can say. There is even a report, remember the Kurds wanted to go for independence, and everybody shut them down. Everybody shut down the borders. With whom did the Kurds make a deal? With the Iranians. And so the Iranians are going to back the Kurds in a confrontation with Turkey. So we have to watch that too. Again, the bottom line is, as far as I'm concerned, who's protecting the Christians? It's the Iranians. It's the Shiites. It's the Druze. It's the Hezbollah. I mean, if these people had any brains, they'd make an alliance with Israel. But they're fighting over each other how to destroy Israel. So Israel has to go with America, and America's with the Sunnis. So at this stage, Israel is actually getting closer to the Sunni countries, which are much more committed to destroying Israel than the Shiites. It sounds confusing. It is confusing. But like I said before, Iran has said to Egypt it would blow up the Aswan Dam if they went against Bashar al-Assad. Iran has said to the Turks that they would stir up the 31% population of Alawite Shiites in Turkey against Erdogan if he went against Bashar al-Assad. What do we see in the end? That the Turks actually do march into Syria, and they do take over Afrin, which was the Kurdish stronghold, and the Turks don't show any plan of leaving Afrin. In other words, the Turks want to conquer as much land as they can, supposedly at the expense of the Kurds, but it's really at the expense of Syria and the Shiites. So I would say, look under the surface. Under the surface, there is this 1,400-year battle between the Sunnis and the Shiites. And unlike the Catholics and Protestants who patched up somehow, there's no patching up between Sunnis and Shiites. And Israel is kind of like trying to stay out of it. And so Israel does attack Iranian positions in Syria when it is seen that this is either transferring what they call equation-changing weapons to Hezbollah or threatening Israel with the militias.
Absolutely. And Avi, I'd love to know your opinion, particularly on some of the incredibly outrageous and offensive statements made by President Erdogan of Turkey and a fellow member of NATO in saying that the Muslim world should unite and there should be a Muslim army to attack and destroy Israel. Now, this is not someone who should be saying statements like this, who is a member of NATO and also a nation that wants to join the European Union.
And what would you say if Turkey decided to invade the 18 Greek islands in the Aegean? What would you say if the Turks say, guess what, we want to retake Bulgaria or Romania or Serbia? I mean, you have to remember the Turks ruled all the way to the Italian border at one time. And the Turks are saying anything that has been conquered by Islam and has been taken away from Islam must return to Islam. They have their eyes on Spain. They have their eyes on North Africa. And these are all things that, Europeans are lovey-dovey. Forgive me for saying it, because Europeans can also be crusaders. But they're lovey-dovey, and they're forgiving, and they're forgetting the history. The Islamic world does not forget the history.
So let's have a look now at this growing alliance that's coming together between the Turks, the Russians, and the Iranians. And Avi, I know what you've said in this program, the fact that, you know, for example, there was an agreement to come together over Syria between the Turks, the Iranians and the Russians, and you don't think this can develop into a military alliance. But isn't there another factor going on, is the fact that the Turks, the Russians and the Iranians actually hate Israel, they hate the United States. So therefore, on that one reason, could they not unite?
They could unite on the surface.
Yeah.
But there is the underflow of so much history. And like I said before, the Iranians are backing the Kurds against the Turks. Don't forget, a quarter of Turkey is Kurdish. So they are allies, but they're stabbing each other in the back. And I want to throw a rabbit out of the hat. You know, there's this war in the Ukraine, and yes, the Russians are trying to retake areas that were part of Russia before 1954. The Ukrainians see the Turks as their allies because the Turks are the enemies of Russia. Ukrainians are the enemies of Russia. And Ukraine wants to join the European Union, so do the Turks. So there's a very strange Catholic Islamic alliance between Ukraine and Turkey, something we have to watch also.
Absolutely. And you've written this book.
It's all in the book.
It's called
yes.
Islamic Rivalries. ISIS and Iran are fighting for the heart of the Islamic identity. We're coming to the end of the program, so I definitely want your views on what a nuclear Iran would mean for the Middle East.
Okay, well, firstly, as I said earlier in the show, if Egypt, which is Sunni, does something which is against the Shiites, the Iranians have said, we're going to nuke the Aswan Dam. If you nuke the Aswan Dam, there's going to be a flood of Lake Nasser going all the way to the Mediterranean. And the Nile Valley will be uninhabitable for 40 years, as it says in Ezekiel 28 and Ezekiel 29. So this could lead to a fulfillment of a certain Bible prophecy. Some people thought it was Israel that might want to do that, but I say it's Iran that is going to do it. There is a teaching in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, which is a Jewish book, but it was taught to me by my Christian friends, where you have three armies besieging Jerusalem. You have Ammon, you have Edom, and you have Seir. Three armies that are all from Abraham, attacking the Jews in Jerusalem. King Jehoshaphat is approached by the people saying, we're surrounded, we're going to be destroyed, what do we do? He said, get on your faces before the Lord, go to the temple, pray before the high priest, and he will pray to God, and there'll be an answer. Next morning, after everybody prayed, they opened up the gates of the cities, and the three armies destroyed each other and also got all kinds of plagues. And this is what God does to the enemies of Israel, whether they're Shiite or Sunni.
Absolutely. And what sort of message do you have for our viewers, and how can they pray for Israel's protection amongst these emerging threats that are developing from the Middle East?
That God's will be done on earth and in heaven. Because if God is God, he's going to defend Israel, he's going to defend the Jews, and he's going to defend the Christians, and he's going to defend Judeo-Christian Western civilization and democracy.
Absolutely. And Avi, in terms of other speaking engagements, I mean, you speak around the world. You're based in Israel mainly. You've got a speaking tour up in the States. How can our viewers get to know you more through your writings, through your books, and also the many TV broadcasts you do around the world?
Well, you definitely have my website, avilipkin.net. I have like 300 radio and TV interviews on YouTube and Google and Wikipedia. So I'm there, and I've dedicated 27 years of my life to this, and many people thought I was going to retire. I said, you can't retire when you're serving God, and you cannot complain either.
Absolutely. And if your party, the Bible blog, emerges in the Knesset, what sort of force do you think that will be in the Israeli parliament?
At this stage, I believe that it is a possibility in the next elections in a year and a half, if the elections are in a year and a half. If they're sooner, it's going to be a lot harder, to get 145,000 votes and get in with the first three MPs or MKs. I think that eventually, if you have 100,000 Arab Christians, 100,000 Ethiopians, and 300,000 Russian Christians, you're talking about 500,000. And then you have about 300,000 Jews married to the Christians, that's 800,000. So we could pick up about 14, 15, 16 members of Knesset, which would be very influential. And then when the 10 million Jews and Christians in the West come home to Israel and join my party, or majority of them, my party becomes the biggest party in the Knesset.
And that'll be extremely interesting. It happens, Avi. And finally, how do our viewers pray for Israel at this time?
Well, like I said before, learn the Bible, read the Bible, learn the Bible, and pray that God's will be done according to His word.
Amen. Avi, thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report.
Always great to be here in London.
Pleasure. And I just want to thank you for watching today's program. Thankfully, we all believe in the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's who we need to look up to pray and intercede for Israel's protection against the emerging threats that we're seeing in the Middle East today.
There's a battle raging over a people and a land. Will you rage with the nations, or will you stand and say, I believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Spoken many years ago. And I believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I believe in the words of the covenant spoken many years ago. Covenant spoken many years ago. I believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I believe in the words of the covenant spoken many years ago.
I believe in the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
For the kingdom,
stand here,
for the nation,
place of
you be strong.
God talked with Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov.
For the kingdom,
He said,
for the nation,
here is the land of the Hebrews.
I believe
in the covenants of Abraham, Isaac, and
Jacob. I shall plant them in their land, and they shall no longer be pulled up in the land I have given them.
Jag tror på förbundet som Gud slöt med Abraham, Isak, Jakob.
I will bless those who bless you,
And I will curse those who curse you.
and in you
All the families of the earth shall be blessed.
He remembers His covenant forever, the word which He has commanded for 1,000 generations.
We believe in the covenants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
In the sand, where will you stand?